Chapter 3. Political Leaders of the Korean War. The following brief biographies of major political leaders from North Korea, South Korea, the United States, the Soviet Union, and China concentrate on their actions during the Korean War. North Korea. Kim Il-sung. B. April 15, 1912. Manjayandi, near Pyongyang, Korea. Now in North Korea. D. July 8, 1994, Pyongyang. Kim Il-sung was the communist leader of North Korea from 1948 until his death in 1994. He was the nation's premier from 1948 to 1972, chairman of its dominant Korean Workers' Communist Party from 1949, and president and head of state from 1972. Kim was the son of parents who fled to Manchuria in 1925 to escape the Japanese rule of Korea. He joined the Korean guerrilla resistance against the Japanese occupation in the 1930s and adopted the name of an earlier legendary Korean guerrilla fighter against the Japanese. Kim was noticed by the Soviet military authorities, who sent him to the Soviet Union for military and political training. There he joined the local Communist Party. During World War II, Kim led a Korean contingent as a major in the Soviet Army. After the Japanese surrender during 1945, Kim returned with other Soviet-trained Koreans to establish a communist provisional government under Soviet auspices in what would become North Korea. He became the first premier of the newly formed Democratic People's Republic of Korea in 1948, and in 1949, he became chairman of the Korean Workers' Party, hoping to reunify Korea by force. Kim launched an invasion of South Korea in 1950, thereby igniting the Korean War. His attempt to extend his rule to the South was repelled by U.S. troops and other UN forces, however, and it was only through massive Chinese support that he was able to repel a subsequent invasion of North Korea by UN forces. The Korean War ended in a stalemate in 1953. As head of state, Kim crushed the remaining domestic opposition and in at his last rivals for power within the Korean Workers' Party. He became his country's absolute ruler and set about transforming North Korea into an AUS-tier militaristic and highly regimented society devoted to the twin goals of industrialization and the reunification of the Korean peninsula under North Korean rule. Kim introduced a philosophy of Juche, or self-reliance, under which North Korea tried to develop its economy with little or no help from foreign countries. North Korea's state-run economy grew rapidly in the 1950s and 60s, but eventually stagnated, with shortages of food occurring by the early 90s. The omnipresent personality cult sponsored by Kim was part of a highly effective propaganda system that enabled him to rule unchallenged for 46 years over one of the world's most isolated and repressive societies. In his foreign policy, he cultivated close ties with both the Soviet Union and China and remained consistently hostile to South Korea and the United States. While retaining control of the Korean Workers' Party, Kim relinquished the office of premier and was elected president of North Korea in December 1972. In 1980, he raised his eldest son, Kim Jong-il, to high posts in the party and the military, in effect designating the younger Kim as his heir. However, Kim remained in power for more than a decade more, until his death in 1994. Kim Jong-il, b. February 16, 1941, Siberia, Russia, USSR. Kim Jong-il, son of the former North Korean premier and Communist Korean Workers' Party, KWP, Chairman Kim Il-sung, was the successor to his father as ruler of North Korea. The official North Korean version of Kim Jong-il's life different from the biography documented elsewhere, says that he was born at a guerrilla base camp on Mount Peak II, the highest point on the Korean peninsula. It attributes many precocious abilities to him, and it claims his birth was accompanied by such auspicious signs as the appearance of a double rainbow in the sky. During the Korean War, 1950-53, he was placed in safety in northeastern China, Manchuria, by his father, although the official biography does not mention the episode. After attending a pilot's training college in East Germany for 2 years, he graduated in 1963 from Kim Il-sung University. He served in numerous routine posts in the KWP before becoming his father's secretary. He worked closely with his father in the 1967 Party Purge and then was assigned several important jobs. Kim was appointed in September 1973 to the powerful position of party secretary in charge of organization, propaganda, and agitation. Kim was officially designated his father's successor in October 1980, was given command of the armed forces in 1990-91, and held high-ranking posts on the Central Committee, in the Politburo, and in the party secretariat. When Kim Il-sung died of a heart attack in 1994, Kim Jong-il became North Korea's de facto leader. He was named chairman of the KWP in October 1997, and in September 1998, he formally assumed the country's highest post. Since the position of president had been eliminated by the Supreme People's Assembly, which reserved for Kim Il-sung the posthumous title of Eternal President, the younger Kim was re-elected chairman of the National Defense Commission, an office whose powers were expanded. During his leadership of the country, Kim built on the mystique already surrounding his father and himself. Conflicting, omnipresent personality cult sponsored by Kim was part of a highly effective propaganda system that enabled him to rule unchallenged for 46 years over one of the world's most isolated and repressive societies. In his foreign policy, he cultivated close ties with both the Soviet Union and China and remained consistently hostile to South Korea and the United States. While retaining control of the Korean Workers' Party, Kim relinquished the office of premier and was elected president of North Korea in December 1972. In 1980, he raised his eldest son, Kim Jong-il, to high posts in the party and the military, in effect designating the younger Kim as his heir. However, Kim remained in power for more than a decade more, until his death in 1994. Kim Jong-il, b. February 16, 1941, Siberia, Russia, USSR. Kim Jong-il, son of the former North Korean premier and Communist Korean Workers' Party, KWP, Chairman Kim Il-sung, was the successor to his father as ruler of North Korea. The official North Korean version of Kim Jong-il's life, different from the biography documented elsewhere, says that he was born at a guerrilla base camp on Mount Peak II, the highest point on the Korean peninsula. It attributes many precocious abilities to him, and it claims his birth was accompanied by such auspicious signs as the appearance of a double rainbow in the sky. During the Korean War, 1950-53, he was placed in safety in northeastern China, Manchuria, by his father, although the official biography does not mention the episode. After attending a pilot's training college in East Germany for 2 years, he graduated in 1963 from Kim Il-sung University. He served in numerous routine posts in the KWP before becoming his father's secretary. He worked closely with his father in the 1967 Party Purge and then was assigned several important jobs. Kim was appointed in September 1973 to the powerful position of party secretary in charge of organization, propaganda, and agitation. Kim was officially designated his father's successor in October 1980, was given command of the armed forces in 1990 to 91, and held high-ranking posts on the Central Committee, in the Politburo, and in the party secretariat. When Kim Il-sung died of a heart attack in 1994, Kim Jong-il became North Korea's de facto leader. He was named chairman of the KWP in October 1997, and in September 1998, he formally assumed the country's highest post, since the position of president had been eliminated by the Supreme People's Assembly, which reserved for Kim Il-sung the posthumous title of Eternal President. The younger Kim was re-elected chairman of the National Defense Commission, an office whose powers were expanded. During his leadership of the country, Kim built on the mystique already surrounding his father and himself. Conflicting information circulated regarding his personal life, most of it unreliable and perhaps deliberately serving to add to the mystery. It was known that Kim took an interest in the arts and in aged greater creativity in literature and film, although the products remained primarily propaganda tools. A well-known film buff, Kim headed a movie studio before ascending to the country's leadership. It produced works célèbres ing socialist values, Kim Il-sung and his national policy of self-reliance, Juche, and later, Kim Jong-il himself and his military first, Songin Chongchai, Pol, IC, as part of his desire to create better films. In the late 1970s, the younger Kim had a South Korean film director, Shin Sang-ok, and his wife, actress Choi Eun-hee, abducted to the north, where they were pressed into service until their 1986 escape. After becoming North Korea's leader, and with his country facing a struggling economy and a famine, Kim made moves toward amending North Korea's long-standing policy of isolationism. Throughout the late 1990s and the early 21st century, Kim sought to improve ties with a number of countries. However, these relations with the international community have been strained over the issue of nuclear weapons. The first decade of the 21st century was characterized by negotiations and sanctions over North Korea's nuclear program, particularly with the United States. Furthermore, despite reaching an agreement with South Korea to take steps toward reunification in 2000, inter-Korean relations have deteriorated. Kim's regime announced that it planned to close the land border and all non-military telephone links with South Korea in 2008. A positive note was sounded in August 2009, when Kim agreed to the release of 2 American journalists. The 2 women, Yuna Lee and Laura Ling, had been imprisoned in March 2009 by North Korea for having illegally entered the country. On August 4, 2009, former U.S. President Bill Clinton flew to Pyongyang for a private meeting with the North Korean leader, after which Kim issued a special pardon. The 2 women flew back to the United States with Clinton the following day. South Korea. Syngman Rhee, B. March 26, 1875, Pyeongsan, Gwangseo Province. Korea now in North Korea, D. July 19, 1965, Honolulu, Hawaii, U.S. Syngman Rhee was the first president of the Republic of Korea, South Korea. Rhee completed a traditional Class I Cal Confucian education and then entered a Methodist school where he learned English. He became an ardent nationalist and, ultimately, a Christian. In 1896, he joined with other young Korean leaders to form the Independence Club, a group dedicated to asserting Korean independence from Japan. When right-wing elements destroyed the club in 1898, Rhee was arrested and imprisoned until 1904. On his release, he went to the United States, where in 1910 he received a Ph.D. from Princeton University, becoming the first Korean to earn a doctorate from an American university. He returned home in 1910, the year in which Korea was annexed by Japan. Ri found it impossible to hide his hostility toward Japanese rule, and after working briefly in a YMCA and as a high school principal, he emigrated to Hawaii, which was then a U.S. territory. He spent the next 30 years as a spokesman for Korean independence, trying in vain to win international support for his cause. In 1919, he was elected in absentia president of the newly established Korean Provisional Government in Shanghai. Ri relocated to Shanghai the following year, but returned to Hawaii in 1925. He remained president of the Provisional Government for 20 years, eventually being pushed out of the leadership by younger Korean nationalists centered in China. Ri had refused to recognize an earlier impeachment for misuse of his authority by the Provisional Government in the 1920s. Ri moved to Washington, D.C., and spent the World War II years trying to secure Allied promises of Korean independence. After the war, since Ri was the only Korean leader well known to Americans, he was returned to Korea ahead of the other members of the Provisional Government. He campaigned for a policy of immediate independence and unification of the country. He soon built up a mass political organization supported by strong armed squads and a following among the police. With the assassination of the major moderate leaders, including Song Jin-woo and Chung Duk-soo, Ri remained the most influential leader, and his new party won the elections in South Korea. In 1948, he became president of the Republic of Korea, a post to which he was re-elected in 1952, 1956, and 1960. As president, Ri assumed dictato, real powers, tolerating little domestic opposition to his program. Ri purged the National Assembly of members who opposed him and outlawed the opposing Time Progressive Party, whose leader, Cho Bong-am, was executed for treason. He controlled the appointment of mayors, village headmen, and chiefs of police. He even defied the United Nations, UN the Korean War, 1950-53. Hoping that UN forces would continue to fight and eventually unite North and South Korea under one government. Ri dared the truce talks by ordering the release in June 1953 of some 25,000 anti-communist North Korean prisoners under the agreed-upon truce settlement. These men would have been repatriated to North Korea. Stunned, the communists broke off the negotiations and renewed their attack, largely ignoring the UN forces and concentrating their fire on Ri's South Korean troops. Having made their point, the communists then resumed negotiations, and a truce settlement was speedily signed. In spite of his authoritarian policies, Ri failed to prevent the election of an opposition vice president, Chung Mayan, in 1956. Government claims that the March 1960 elections gave Ri more than 90% of the popular vote, 55% in 1956, provoked student-led demonstrations against election fraud, resulting in heavy casualties and demands for Ri's resignation. These demands were supported by the Anani Mao's vote of the National Assembly and by the U.S. government. Ri resigned on April 27, 1960, and went into exile in Hawaii. Yun Pasun, born in 1897, Asan, Korea, now in South Korea, D. July 18, 1990, Seoul Corps. Yun Pasun served 1960-62 as a liberal president of South Korea during the Second Republic. Yun received an M.A. 1930 from the University of Edinburgh and managed his family's business affairs. When Japanese rule of Korea ended in 1945, Yun entered politics. His mentor, President Ri, appointed him mayor of Seoul in 1948 and Minister of Commerce and Industry in 1949. In time, however, he came to disagree with Rhee's authoritar, Ian Rule. He was elected to the National Assembly in 1954, and the next year he was among the founders of the opposing Thai Democratic Party. After the student-led pro-democracy uprising of 1960 forced Rhee to resign, Yoon was elected president. Internal rivalries within the Democratic Party rendered his leadership ineffectual. However, in less than a year, a coup brought the army's Major Gen. Park Chung-hee to power. Though Yoon was initially persuaded to stay in office, he resigned in 1962. He then became a vehement critic of Park's repressive regime and opposed Park in the 1963 and 1967 presidential elections. He was twice convicted of instigate, the overthrow of the government, and received suspended prison sentences. After Park's assassination in 1979, Yoon was tried for organizing a mass pro-reform rally, and again he received a suspended sentence. He retired from politics in 1980. Park Chung-hee, b. September 30th or November 14th, 1917, Kumi, North Gyeongsang Province, Korea, now in South Korea, d. October 26, 1979, Seoul, S.Corp. South Korean President Park Chung-hee at podium with U.S. President Lyndon B. Johnson, right. 1965. Francis Miller / Time and Life Pictures / Getty Images. Park Chung-hee was President of the Republic of Korea, South Korea, from 1963 to his death. His 18-year rule brought about enormous economic expansion, though at the cost of civil liberties and political freedom. Born into an impoverished rural family, Park graduated in 1937 with top honors from Taegu Normal School, after which he taught primary school. After attending a Japanese military academy, Park served as a second lieutenant in the Japanese Army during World War II and became an officer in the Korean Army when Korea was freed from Japanese rule after the war. He was made a brigadier general 1953 during the Korean War 1950-53 and was promoted to general in 1958. On May 16, 1961, he led a military coup that overthrew the Second Republic. He remained the leader of the junta until 2 years later, when he won the first of his 3 terms as president of the Third Republic. At home, Park maintained a policy of guided democracy, with restrictions on personal freedoms, suppression of the press and of opposition parties, and control over the judicial system and the universities. He organized and expanded the Korean Central Intelligence Agency, KCIA, now the National Intelligence Service, which became a much-feared agent of political repression. Park claimed that all his measures were necessary to fight communism. In foreign affairs, he continued the close relations his predecessors Rhee and Yoon had maintained with the United States. Park was responsible in large part for South Korea's economic miracle. The programs he initiated gave his country one of the fastest-growing economies in the world. On October 17, 1972, Park declared martial law, and 1 month later he installed a repressive authoritarian regime, the Yushin Revitalization Reform Order, with a new constitution that gave him sweeping powers. He grew increasingly harsh toward political dissidents. After Park's dismissal, 1979, of popular opposition leader Kim Young-sam from the National Assembly, Korea erupted with severe riots and demonstrations. Park was assassinated by his lifelong friend Kim Jae-kyu, the head of the KCIA. Chun Do-hwan, b. January 18, 1931, Hapcheon, South Gyeongsang, Korea, now in South Korea. Chun Do-hwan was president of South Korea from 1980 to 1988. Born into a peasant family, Chun entered the Korean Military Academy in 1951. Following his graduation in 1955, he became an infantry officer and in 1958 married Lee Soon-ja, daughter of Brig General Lee Kyu-dong. Chun commanded a South Korean division in South Vietnam during the Vietnam War and rose rapidly through the ranks. After Park seized power in 1961, Chun served as Civil Ser, Vice Secretary for the Junta, 1961-62, and in 1963, with a nominal restoration of civilian government, as Chief of Personnel of the KCI. He served in various other official posts and was made a Brigadier General in 1978. After Park's assassination in 1979, Chun, as the Chief of Army Security Command, took charge of the investigation of his death. He arrested several suspects, including his rival, the Army Chief of Staff, General Chung Sung-hwa, December 1979, and he purged many of Chung's support, heirs in a virtual coup by one military faction against another. Although the official president was Choi Kyu-ha, Chun emerged as the real holder of power, and in April 1980, he became head of the KCIA. In May, the military under Chun's leadership dropped all pretense of civil rule, declared martial law, and brutally suppressed democratic civilian opposing in the city of Gwangju. After President Choi resigned on August 16th, Chun resigned from the army and on August 27th became president. With the country still under martial law, Chun pushed through a new constitution in late 1980 that allowed him to govern with a firm hand. Chun's tenure was punctuated by several crises, notably a financial scandal in 1982 that forced him to replace half his cabinet in an assassination attempt in Burma, Myanmar, by North Korean agents in 1983 that resulted in the deaths of several top aides and ministers. As president, Chun devoted his efforts to maintaining economic growth and political stability. South Korea continued its export-led economic growth under Chun, and the nation industrialized rapidly. Chun was prohibited by the terms of the 1980 Constitution from serving more than one 7-year term. And in 1987, he picked Roh Tae-woo to be the candidate of the ruling Democratic Justice Party, now part of the Grand National Party. He retired from politics after being succeeded by Roh in 1988, despite public gestures of atonement for abuses of power during his presidency. Chun could not distance himself from the lingering public memory of his actions. In December 1995, both he and Roh were indicted on charges of having accepted bribes during their terms as president. In addition, the outcry over the extent of the fraud, hundreds of millions of dollars, prompted prosecutors to pursue charges which had been brought by the prosecutor's office in 1994 related to their involvement in the 1979 coup and their actions during the 1980 uprising in Gwangju. Both were found guilty of all charges in August 1996. Chun was sentenced to death and Roh to 212 years in prison. Chun's sentence was later reduced to life imprisonment and Roh's to 17 years. Both received presidential pardons in December 1997. Roh Tae-woo, B. December 4th, 1932, near Taegu, Korel, now in South Korea. Roh Tae-woo was president of South Korea, 1988 to 93, and is remembered for instituting democratic reforms. While a high school student in Taegu, Roh became friends with a fellow student, Chun Do-hwan. Following the outbreak of the Korean War, 1950 to 53, Roh joined the South Korean Army and with Chun attended the Korean Military Academy, where they both graduated in 1955. Roh rose steadily through the ranks thereafter, becoming a general by 1979. In October 1979, President Park Chung-hee was assassinated, and in December Chun and some fellow officers launched a coup against the civilian government. Roh, who was then an Army Division commander, gave them crucial support. Roh was a member of the Chun-led junta that ordered the brutal suppression of demonstrators in Gwangju, in May 1980. Chun became president in August of that year. Roh resigned from the military in 1981 and held a series of ministerial posts in Chun's government, including Minister of Political Affairs, 1981, Sports, 1982, and Home Affairs, 1982. As head of the Seoul Olympic Organizing Committee from 1983 to 1986. He oversaw South Korea's preparations for the 1988 Summer Olympic Games held in Seoul. In 1985, Chun chose Roh to become the new chairman of Chun's ruling politi, Cal Party, the Democratic Justice Party, DJP, and in June 1987 Chun chose Roh to be the candidate of the DJP in the upcoming presidential elections. Under the country's existing constitution, Roh was thus practically guaranteed to win the presidency, and this prospect ignited widespread popular unrest. In response, on June 29, 1987, Roh made a historic speech in which he proposed a broad program of democratic reforms, which led to the drafting of a new constitution, approved in October 1987. Chief among its provisions was the direct election of the president by popular vote. In the December 1987 election, both major opposition candidates, Kim Young-sam and Kim Dae-jung, ran against Roh, splitting the opposition vote and thus enabling Roh's victory. He began his 5-year term as president on February 25, 1988. As president, the moderate and conciliatory Roh committed himself to the democratization of South Korean politics, partly as a result of Roh's reforms. The DJP failed to gain a majority of seats in the National Assembly in elections in April 1988, but in 1990 the party, under Roh's leadership, merged with two moderate opposition parties to form a new majority party called the Democratic Liberal Party. In foreign affairs, Roh's government cultivated new ties with the Soviet Union, and later Russia and China obtained South Korea's admission 1991 to the United Nations, and signed an agreement, 1991, with North Korea calling for non-aggression between the two Koreas. In February 1993, he was succeeded by Kim Young-sam, whose subsequent anti-corruption reforms targeted Roh and Chun. In October 1995, Roh publicly apologized for having illegally amassed hundreds of millions of dollars in secret political donations during his term as president. He subsequently was indicted and tried for corruption as well as for mutiny and sedition for his involvement in the 1979 coup, charges that had been leveled in 1994 but not pursued at that time. In August 1996, he was convicted on all counts. He was sentenced to 2,212 years in prison, which was later reduced to 17 years, and was fined about $300 million, a sum equivalent to the amount he was convicted of having taken illegally. Former South Korean President Roh Tae-woo prepares to stand trial on corruption charges in the Seoul District Criminal Court building, December 1995. Shu Yun-kong, AFP, Gitimash. Roh received a pardon in December 1997 from outgoing President Kim Young-sam and President-elect Kim Dae-jung. Kim Young-sam. B. December 20th, 1927, Koj Island, South Gyeongsang Province. Korea, now in South Korea. Kim Young-sam was president of South Korea from 1993 to 1998. Kim graduated from Seoul National University in 1952 and was first elected to the National Assembly in 1954. A centrist liberal, he was successively re-elected until 1979, when he was expelled on October 9th from the Assam Bly for his opposition to Park's presidency. His expulsion touched off riots and demonstrations. To protest Kim's dismissal, all 66 opposition MEM bears of the assembly resigned. After Park's assassination on October 26th, it was assumed that Kim would be a contender in the presidential election, but Chun's military takeover of the government in May 1980 precluded this possibility. Soon after taking power, Chun put Kim under house arrest. In November 1980, Kim was banned from political activity for 8 years, and his party was also banned. The Chun government lifted his house arrest in June 1983, after Kim staged a 23-day hunger strike, and he resumed his political activity in 1985. That year, he reasserted his leadership of the moderate opposition to President Chun. Kim ran unsuccessfully for the South Korean presidency in 1987, splitting the anti-government vote with a rival opposition leader and presidential candidate Kim Dae-jung. In 1990, Kim Young-sam merged his reunification Democratic Party with the ruling Democratic Justice Party, led by President Roh, thus forming a center-right party, called the Democratic Liberal Party, DLP, that dominated Korean politics. As the candidate of the DLP, Kim won election to the presidency in December 1992, defeating Kim Dae-jung and another opposition candidate, Chung Ju-yoon, chairman of the Hyundai Chaebol conglomerate. Once in power, Kim established firm civilian control over the military and tried to make the government more responsive to the electorate. He launched reforms designed to eliminate political corruption and abuses of power, and he even allowed 2 of his presidential predecessors, Roh Tae-woo and Chun Do-hwan, to be prosecuted for various crimes they had committed while in power. The South Korean economy continued to grow at a rapid rate during Kim's presidency, and, with wages rising rapidly, the standard of living reached that of other industrialized countries. Kim was constitutionally barred from seeking a second term as president. His popularity declined rapidly in the last year of his 5-year term because of corruption scandals in his administration and the increasingly precarious state of the South Korean economy, which was caught in a financial crisis that swept through Southeast and East Asia in late 1997. He was succeeded as president by Kim Dae-jung. B. December 3rd, 1925, Mokpo, Hoi Island, Korea, now in South Cholla Province, South Korea. D. August 18, 2009, Seoul, South Korea. Kim Dae-jung was a South Korean politi who became a prominent opposition leader during the tenure of Park Chung-hee. He became the first opposition leader to win election to his country's presidency, 1998 to 2003. Kim received the Nobel Prize for Peace in 2000 for his efforts to restore democracy in South Korea and to improve relations with North Korea. Kim was the son of a middle-class farmer, and he graduated from a Mokpo commercial high school at the top of his class in 1943. He began working as a clerk in a Japanese-owned shipping company, and in 1945 took over the company, eventually becoming a wealthy businessman. During the Korean War, he was captured by the communists and sentenced to be shot, but he managed to escape. In the 1950s, Kim became an ardent pro-democracy activist, and in 1954 voiced opposition to Rhee's policies. After 5 attempts at elective office, Kim finally won a seat on the National Assembly in 1961, but the election was nullified following a military coup d'etat led by Park Chung-hee. By the age of 40, he had earned a reputation as one of South Korea's most gifted orators and charismatic politicians. He became increasingly critical of Park's policies, and in 1971, a year after becoming president of the National Democratic Party, Kim ran against Park in a national presidential election. Kim lost, despite winning more than 40% of the vote. He was by then an outspoken critic of the repressive policies of the Park government. In 1973, Kim was kidnapped from his hotel in Tokyo by agents of the Korean Central Intelligence Agency and was returned forcibly to South Korea. This act severely strained relations between Japan and South Korea. In 1976, Kim was again arrested, having agitated for the restoration of democracy. He was released from house arrest in 1979, just 2 months after Park's assassination on October 26th of that year. Kim was arrested in May 1980 on charges of sedition and conspiracy and sentenced to death, but Park's successor, Chun, commuted the sentence to life imprisonment and later to 20 years. In December 1982, Kim was allowed to leave South Korea for medical treatment in the United States, but the trip became an exile. Able to return to South Korea in 1985, he resumed his role as one of the principal leaders of the political opposition. In 1987, he ran for the presidency and lost after splitting the anti-government vote with rival opposition candidate Kim Young-sam. He ran again for the presidency in 1992, but was defeated by Kim Young-sam, who had merged his own reunification Democratic Party with the ruling Democratic Justice Party to form the DLP. Kim formed a new political party, the National Congress for New Politics, in 1995 and made his fourth bid for the presidency in 1997. By this time, the RUL Democratic Liberal Party had lost popularity because of corruption scandals in Kim Young-sam's administration and the electorate's outrage over the increasing instability. Why of the South Korean economy, which was caught in the financial crisis sweeping through Southeast and East Asia. Kim formed an electoral coalition with the conservative United Liberal Democrats led by Kim Jong-pil, and in the presidential election of December 18, 1997, Kim Dae-jung won a narrow victory over the ruling party's candidate, Lee Hoi-chang. Once in office, Kim immersed himself in overcoming the financial crisis and restructuring banking, business, and labor practices. Under his leadership, South Korea emerged from International Monetary Fund bailout programs in a shorter time than expected. He then set about improving relations with North Korea. His sunshine policy allowed South Koreans to visit relatives in the North and eased rules governing South Korean investment in the country. In 1998, direct talks between the two countries resumed after a 4-year hiatus, and from June 13 to 15, 2000, Kim met with North Korean ruler Kim Jong-il during the historic summit, which marked the first meeting between leaders of North and South Korea. Both sides agreed to work toward eventual reunification. Barred by electoral rules from running for a second term, Kim left office in 2003. He was succeeded by Roh Moo-hyun. Kim died on August 18, 2009, in a Seoul hospital. He was 85. Roh Moo-hyun, b. August 6, 1946, Gimhae, near Busan, Korea, now in South Korea. D. May 23, 2009, Busan S.Corp. Roh Moo-hyun was president of South Korea from 2003 to 2008. Born into a poor family, Roh worked as a night watchman in high school and later served in the military, 1968 to 71. Although he did not attend college, he was able to pass the bar exam in 1975. He was appointed a judge in 1977 and later became a highly respected human rights lawyer, defending student protesters accused of being pro-communist. In the late 1980s, Roh entered politics at the invitation of then-opposition leader Kim Young-sam. Roh won a seat in the National Assembly in 1988 and gained notice for criticizing Chun's military regime. In 1990, he split with his party when Kim made an alliance with General-turned-President Roh Tae-woo. That alliance led to Kim's election as president, and Roh Moo-hyun's political fortunes seemed to crumble. He lost his seat in the National Assembly in 1992 and failed to regain it in 1996. He also lost a bid to become mayor of Busan in 1995. Nevertheless, Roh continued to favor democratic reforms and refused a compromise with the pro-military party. He eventually led a small opposition party into an alliance with Kim Dae-jung. And when Kim came to power in 1998, Roh served in his cabinet. In 2002, Roh, supported by outgoing President Kim, made a bid for the presidency. Roh favored negotiating with North Korea rather than isolating it. He preferred using diplomacy in persuading North Korea to abandon its nuclear weapons policy, and he was openly critical of U.S. policy toward the Korean Peninsula, a stance that appealed to the growing anti-American sentiment in the country. In December 2002, Roh defeated Lee Hoi-chang in a tightly contested presidential race, receiving 48.9% of the vote to Lee's 46.6%. After taking office in February 2003, Roh faced a faltering economy and labor unrest. He also found himself in the midst of a financial scandal after several of his aides were accused of accepting illegal campaign donations. In October 2003, Roh called for a national vote of confidence, but Parliament opposed the referendum, which was not provided for in South Korea's constitution. Allegations of election law violations and economic mismanagement soon followed, and in March 2004, Roh was impeached by Parliament, a move that was highly unpopular with the public. Forced to temporarily step down, he was reinstated as president in May after the Constitutional Court overturned the impeachment. Under the shadow of scandal for most of his term, Roh was unable to take advantage of the parliamentary majority that his party achieved in late 2004. Continuing economic malaise in South Korea caused his poll numbers to drop to the single digits. And a North Korean nuclear test in 2006 was seen as a sign of failure for the soft diplomacy championed by Roh and his predecessor. While Roh was unable to run for a second term because of South Korean election law, in December 2007 his chosen successor, Chung Dong-young, was soundly defeated by Grand National Party candidate Lee Myung-bak. Roh was later investigated over alleged tie-ins of bribery, and in May 2009 he committed suicide by jumping off a cliff. Lee Myung-bak, b. December 19, 1941, Osaka, Japan. Lee Myung-bak was elected president of South Korea in 2008. Lee was born in wartime Japan and was the fifth of 7 children. In 1946, his family returned to Korea, but their boat capsized during the journey, and they landed ashore with little more than the clothes they were wearing. They fled in his father's hometown of Pohang, and to help support his family, Lee sold rice snacks during the day and attended school at night. He enrolled at Korea University, Seoul, in 1961, paying his tuition by working as a garbage collector. He was imprisoned in 1964 for participating in protests against the normalization of relations between South Korea and Japan. Lee was blacklisted by the government for his student activism, which limited his job prospects with some of the larger established firms. He joined the fledgling Hyundai construction company Paney in 1965. At the time, it had fewer than 100 employees, and Lee advanced quickly through the executive ranks. When he resigned as CEO in 1992, the Hyundai Group had some 160,000 employees, and its products range from automobiles to heavy machinery to consumer electronics. Lee entered politics in 1992, winning election to the National Assembly as a member of the conservative New Korea Party. He was re-elected in 1996, only to resign 2 years later after he was found guilty of violating campaign spending limits. He withdrew from politics and spent a year of self-imposed exile in the United States. He returned to South Korea and was elected mayor of Seoul in 2002. His administration focused on improving the livability of the central business district, most notably through an ambitious urban beautification project. This included the restoration of the Chongai Stream, a downtown waterway paved over by Hyundai some 4 decades earlier. While business owners initially balked at the project's $900 million price tag, it proved to be a success with both Seoul natives and tourists when it opened in September 2005. Upon completion of his term as mayor, Lee successfully campaigned for the presidency of South Korea, winning election by a landslide on December 19, 2007. A 2001 business scandal surfaced in the days leading up to the election, however, and the matter was directed to an independent counsel. United States. Harry S. Truman. B. May 8, 1884. Lamar, Missouri, USD. December 26, 1972. Kansas City, Missouri. Harry S. Truman was the 33rd President of the United States, 1945 to 53. He led his nation through the final stages of World War II and through the early years of the Cold War, vigorously opposing Soviet expansionism in Europe and sending U.S. forces to turn back a communist invasion of South Korea. In June 1950, military forces of Communist North Korea suddenly plunged southward across the 38th parallel bound, ARI, in an attempt to seize non-communist South Korea. Outraged, Truman report. Edley responded, "By God, I'm going to let them, North Korea, have it." Truman did not ask Congress for a declaration of war, and he was later criticized for this decision. Instead, he sent to South Korea, with UN-sanctioned U.S. forces under General Douglas MacArthur, to repel the invasion. Ill-prepared for combat, the Americans were pushed back to the southern tip of the Korean peninsula before MacArthur's brilliant inch-on offensive drove the Communists north of the 38th parallel. South Korea was liberated, but MacArthur wanted a victory over the Communists, not merely restoration of the status quo. U.S. forces drove northward, nearly to the Yalu River boundary with Manchuria. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops then poured into North Korea, pushing the fighting once again down to the 38th parallel. When MacArthur insisted on extending the war to China and using nuclear weapons to defeat the Communists, Truman removed him from command, a courageous assertion of civilian control over the military. The administration was devoted to its policy of containment. The war, however, dragged on inconclusively past the end of Truman's presidency, eventually claiming the lives of more than 33,000 Americans and leaving a residual bitterness at home. The inability of the United States to achieve a clear-cut victory in Korea following Soviet conquests in Eastern Europe and the triumph of communism in China led many Americans to conclude that the United States was losing the Cold War. Accusations began to fly that the president and some of his top advisors were soft on communism, thereby explaining why the United States, without K's tying the world's greatest power in 1945, had been unable to halt the communist advance. As the nation's second Red Scare, the fear that communists had infiltrated key POSI tie-ins in government and society took hold in the late 1940s and early 50s, Truman's popularity began to plummet. In March 1952, he announced he was not going to run for re-election. By the time he left the White House in January 1953, his approval rating was just 31%. It had peaked at 87% in July 1945. Dean Acheson, B. April 11, 1893, Middletown, Connecticut, U.S. D. October 12, 1971, Sandy Spring, Maryland. Dean Acheson was a U.S. Secretary of State, 1949 to 53, and advisor to 4 presidents. He was the principal creator of U.S. foreign policy in the Cold War period following World War II, and he helped to create the Western Alliance in a POSI tie-in to the Soviet Union and other communist nations. Appointed Secretary of State by Truman in January 1949, Acheson promoted the formation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, the first. U.S. Secretary of State Dean Acheson, Center, calls to order a meeting of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, on September 15, 1950. Encyclopedia Britannica Incorporated. Peacetime defensive alliance entered into by the United States. Despite his strong stance in what he conceived to be a global confrontation with communism, Acheson was the target of attack by foreign policy critics within both political parties. His minds were particularly inflamed when, during the congressional hearings of Senator Joseph R. McCarthy on subversive activities, 1949 to 50, Acheson refused to fire any of his State Department subordinates. His most widely publicized remark was, "I will not turn my back on Alger Hiss," a former State Department officer later convicted of perjury in denying that he had engaged in espionage in the 1930s. U.S. Secretary of State Dean Acheson signs the North Atlantic Treaty on April 4, 1949, as U.S. President Harry S. Truman, second from left, and Vice President Alban W. Barkley, left, look on. Encyclopedia Britannica Incorporated. Demands for Acheson's resignation increased after the entry of Communist China into the Korean War, 1950 to 53. The storm of public controversy erupted more violently after the president removed MacArthur as commander of forces in Korea. Acheson subsequently established the policies of non-recognition, tie-in of China, and aid to the nationalist regime of General Chiang Kai-shek on Taiwan. Later, he also supported U.S. aid to the French colonial regime in Indochina. Dwight D. Eisenhower, B. October 14, 1890, Denison, Texas, U.S. D. March 28, 1969, Washington, D.C. Dwight D. Eisenhower was the supreme commander of the Allied forces in Western Europe during World War II and the 34th President of the United States, 1953 to 61. As early as 1943, Eisenhower was mentioned as a possible presidential candidate. His personal qualities and military. Dwight D. Eisenhower, Center, the Republican Party nominee for U.S. President with running mate Richard Nixon, left, holding child, at campaign headquarters in Washington, D.C., September 10, 1952. Encyclopedia Britannica Incorporated. Reputation prompted both parties to woo him. As the campaign of 1952 neared, Eisenhower let it be known that he was a Republican in the eastern wing of the party, headed by Governor Thomas E. Dewey of New York, made an intensive effort to persuade him to seek the Republican presidential nomination. His name was entered in several state prima rise against the more conservative Senator Robert Taft of Ohio. Although the results were mixed, Eisenhower decided to run. In June 1952, he retired from the Army after 37 years of service, returned to the United States, and began to campaign actively. At the party con, Vintion in July, after a bitter fight with Taft supporters, Eisenhower won the nomination on the first ballot. His running mate was Senator Richard M. Nixon of California. The Democrats nominated Governor Adlai E. Stevenson of Illinois for president and Senator John Sparkman of Alabama for vice president. Eisenhower urged economy and honesty in government and promised to visit Korea to explore the possibilities for ending the Korean War, which had broken out in 1950 between communist North Korea and pro-Western South Korea and soon involved United Nations, mainly U.S. troops and communist Chinese forces. Many Republicans, including his running mate Sr. Richard M. Nixon of California, Dwight D. Eisenhower delivering his Atoms for Peace speech to the United Nations General Assembly in New York City, December 1953. Copyright United Nations/IAEA. Spoke of pro-communist disloyalty within the Truman administration and called for stringent anti-subversive measures. The Eisenhower-Nixon ticket won handily, carrying 39 states, winning the electoral vote 442 to 89 and collecting more than 33 million popular votes. Eisenhower kept his campaign prom, ISC, and visited Korea shortly after his inauguration. Partly, perhaps, because of Joseph Stalin's death in March 1953, and partly because Eisenhower hinted at his willingness to use nuclear weapons. The president was able to negotiate a truce for the Korean War in July 1953. John Foster Dulles, B. February 25, 1888, Washington, D.C. May 24, 1959, Washington, D.C. John Foster Dulles was the U.S. Secretary of State, 1953 to 59, under Eisenhower. He was the architect of many major elements of U.S. foreign policy in the Cold War with the Soviet Union after World War II. Dulles viewed his appointment as Secretary of State by Eisenhower in January 1953 as a mandate to originate foreign policy. The State Department, Dulles once told an aide, can only keep control of foreign policy as long as we have ideas. A man bent on realizing his ideas, he was an assiduous planner, and once he enjoyed Eisenhower's complete confidence, policy planning flourished during his administration. Dulles, fully aware that NATO would be effective only for the defense of Western Europe, leaving the Middle East, the Far East, and the Pacific Islands unprotected, was eager to fill those gaps. He initiated the Manila Conference in 1954, which resulted in the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, SEATO, pact that united 8 nations either located in Southeast Asia or with interests there in a neutral defense pact. This treaty was followed in 1955 by the Baghdad Pact, later renamed the Central Treaty Organization, CENTO, uniting the so-called northern tier countries of the Middle East, Turkey, Iraq, Iran, and Pakistan in a defense organization. 3 factors determined Dulles' foreign policy: his profound detestation of communism, which was in part based on his deep religious faith, his powerful personality, which often insisted on leading rather than following public opinion, and his strong belief, as an international lawyer, in the value of treaty ties. Of the 3, passionate hostility to communism was the leitmotif of his policy. Wherever he went, He carried with him Joseph Stalin's problems of Leninism and impressed upon his aides the need to study it as a blueprint for conquest similar to Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf. He seemed to derive personal satisfaction from pushing the Soviet Union to the brink. In fact, in 1956, he wrote in a magazine article that if you're scared to go to the brink, you're lost. Soviet Union and China. Joseph Stalin. B. December 21st, December 9th. Old Style. 1879, Gori, Georgia, Russian Empire. D. March 5th, 1953, Moscow, Russia, USSR. Joseph Stalin was Secretary General of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, 1922 to 53, and Premier of the Soviet State, 1941 to 53. For a quarter of a century, Stalin dictatorially ruled the Soviet Union and transformed it into a major world power. During the quarter of a century preceding his death, Stalin probably exercised greater political power than any other figure in history. Stalin industrialized the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, forcibly collectivized its agriculture, consolidated his position by intensive police terror, helped to defeat Germany in 1941 to 45, and extended Soviet controls to include a belt of Eastern European states. Chief architect of Soviet totalitarianism and a skilled but phenomenally ruthless organizer, he destroyed the remnants of individual freedom and failed to promote individual prosperity. Yet he created a mighty military industrial complex and led the Soviet Union into the nuclear age. Far from continuing his World War II alliance with the United States and Great Britain, Stalin now regarded these countries, and especially the United States, as the arch-enemies that he needed after Hitler's death. At home, the primacy of Marxist ideology was harshly reasserted. Stalin's chief ideological hatchet man, Andrei Zhdanov, a secretary of the Central Committee, asserted hopes for domestic relaxation, widely aroused in the Soviet Union during World War II, were thus sadly disappointed. Joseph Stalin, 1950. Saw photo. Mao Zedong. B. December 26, 1893, Shaoshan, Hunan Province, China. D. Sitnev. 1976, Beijing. Great Britain. Stalin now regarded these countries, and especially the United States, as the arch-enemies that he needed after Hitler's death. At home, the primacy of Marxist ideology was harshly reasserted. Stalin's chief ideological hatchet man, Andrei Zhdanov, a secretary of the Central Committee, began a reign of terror in the Soviet artistic and intellectual world. Foreign achievements were derided, and the primacy of Russians as inventors and pioneers in practically every field was Mao Zedong was the principal Chinese Marxist theorist, soldier, and statesman who led his nation's communist revolution, leader of the Chinese Communist Party from 1935. He was chairman, chief of state, of the People's Republic of China from 1949 to 1959 and chairman of the party until his death. When China emerged from a half-century of revolution as the world's most populous nation and launched itself on a path of economic development and social change, Mao Zedong occupied a critical place in the story of the country's resurgence. To be sure, he did not play a dominant role throughout the whole struggle. In the early years of the Chinese Communist Party, he was a secondary figure, though by no means a negligible one. And even after the 1940s, except perhaps during the Cultural Revolution, the crucial decisions were not his alone. Nevertheless, looking at the whole period from the foundation of the Chinese Communist Party in 1921 to Mao's death in 1976, one can fairly regard Mao Zedong as the principal architect of the new China. Mao Zedong, Encyclopedia Britannica, Inc. In December 1949, Mao, now chair, man of the People's Republic of China, traveled to Moscow, where, after 2 months of arduous negotiations, he succeeded in persuading Stalin to sign a treaty of mutual assistance accompanied by limited economic aid. Before the Chinese had time to profit from the resources made available for economic development, however, they found themselves dragged into the Korean War in support of the Moscow-oriented regime in Pyongyang. Only after this baptism of fire did Stalin, according to Mao, begin to have confidence in him and believe he was not first and foremost a Chinese nationalist as opposed to a real communist. Despite these tensions with Moscow, the policies of the People's Republic of China in its early years were in very many respects based, as Mao later said, on copying from the Soviets. While Mao and his comrades had experience in guerrilla warfare, mobilization of the peasants in the countryside, and political administration at the grassroots level, they had no first-hand knowledge of running a state or of large-scale economic development. In such circumstances, the Soviet Union viewed the only available model of a communist government to emulate. A 5-year plan was therefore drawn up under Soviet guidance. It was put into effect in 1953 and included Soviet technical assistance in a number of complete industrial plants. Yet within 2 years, Mao had taken steps that were to lead to the breakdown of the political and ideological alliance with Moscow.